"You've always been the issue," my sister snapped. My mom crossed her arms and proclaimed, "Things were better before you returned." I didn't respond. I just grabbed my keys and left. That was yesterday. This morning, I woke up to 23 missed calls. I, 29M, thought coming home after 5 years in the military would feel like a victory. Instead, it felt like walking into a war zone I wasn't prepared for. The tension started the moment I stepped through the front door with my duffel bag. My sister looked at me like I was some unwelcome stranger, and my mom's smile seemed forced, like she was trying to remember how to be happy to see me. Dad was the only one who seemed genuinely glad I was back, but even his enthusiasm felt strained against the cold atmosphere in the house. The first few weeks were awkward, but I chalked it up to adjustment. 5 years changes people. I'd changed too. The military had given me discipline, purpose, and a different perspective on what really mattered. But apparently, my family had changed in ways I hadn't expected. My sister had gotten married while I was deployed and divorced 6 months later. She'd moved back into our childhood home with my parents, and from what I could gather, she'd been struggling to get back on her feet. My return seemed to complicate things for everyone, though I couldn't understand why. The house felt smaller somehow. My old room had been converted into my sister's home office, so I was sleeping in the basement. Not ideal, but I understood. I was supposed to be temporary anyway, just until I figured out my next move and found my own place. But temporary stretched into months, and the atmosphere grew thicker. My sister would make comments about how I left everyone behind to play soldier, how I missed Dad's heart attack 2 years ago, how I wasn't there when Mom broke her hip. The guilt was suffocating, but I'd been serving my country. I thought they'd understand that. My mom started making little remarks too, about how quiet the house had been before I came back, how they'd established their routines, how my presence was disrupting their peace. She'd say it with a smile, like she was joking, but there was an edge to her voice that cut deep. Dad tried to mediate, but I could see the strain it was putting on him. He was caught between wanting his son home and keeping peace with his wife and daughter. The man who'd raised me to stand up for myself was now asking me to just keep my head down and try to blend in. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening. I'd been job hunting all day, had 2 interviews lined up for the week, and was feeling optimistic about finally moving out and giving everyone their space back. I came home to find my sister and Mom in the kitchen, talking in hushed tones that stopped the moment I walked in. I asked if everything was okay, and my sister turned to me with this look of pure frustration. She told me that everything had been fine before I came back, that I was making everyone uncomfortable, that I was disrupting the life they'd built while I was gone. She said I was selfish for expecting everything to be the same, that I should have called first, should have made sure they actually wanted me back. The words hit like physical blows. I tried to explain that this was my home too, that I'd been gone serving our country, that I'd missed them every single day. But she cut me off and told me that my service didn't give me the right to waltz back in and expect everything to revolve around me. Then my mom joined in. She crossed her arms and looked at me with this cold expression I'd never seen before. She told me that things had indeed been better before I returned, that the house had been peaceful, that my sister had been doing better without the stress of having me around. She said I brought tension wherever I went, that even as a kid I'd been the one causing problems in the family. I stood there in shock. This was my mother, the woman who'd raised me, who'd sent me care packages overseas, who'd written me letters telling me how proud she was of my service. Now she was standing there telling me I was the problem, that my own family was better off without me. My sister wasn't done. She looked me straight in the eye and told me I'd always been the issue. Said I was self-centered, that I'd left them all behind without a second thought, that I'd caused nothing but stress and worry while I was gone. She said my coming back had reminded everyone of how peaceful things could be when I wasn't around. The room went silent after that. Dad had been listening from the living room, and I could see him standing in the doorway with this helpless expression on his face. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. He just stood there while his wife and daughter tore apart his son. I felt something inside me break. Not just my heart, but something fundamental about who I thought I was and where I belonged in the world. These were the people I'd fought for, the family I'd carried with me through every difficult moment overseas. I'd dreamed of coming home to them, and now they were telling me I was the reason their lives were worse. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even try to explain how much their words hurt. I just looked at each of them for a long moment, memorizing their faces, then walked to the hook by the door where I kept my keys. The house was completely silent as I grabbed them. No one asked where I was going. No one tried to stop me. No one said they were sorry or that they didn't mean it. They just watched me leave, and I realized that maybe they'd been hoping I would. I drove around for hours that night, trying to process what had just happened. I ended up at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town, sitting in a corner booth with terrible coffee and a piece of pie I couldn't taste. I kept thinking about all the nights overseas when I'd called home, how normal everyone had sounded, how they'd asked when I was coming back like they actually wanted to know. Had it all been an act? Had they been secretly dreading my return this whole time? The thought made me physically sick. I drove to a motel and got a room for the night. It was small and smelled like cigarettes, but it was mine. For the first time in months, I was somewhere I wasn't making anyone uncomfortable just by existing. I turned off my phone. I didn't want to deal with any attempts at damage control or fake apologies. I needed time to think, to figure out what came next, to process the fact that the family I'd been fighting for apparently didn't want me in their lives. I slept terribly, waking up every few hours with my heart racing. By morning, I felt hollow but strangely clear about what I needed to do. I turned my phone back on to find 23 missed calls. 13 from Dad, 6 from Mom, 4 from my sister. There were also a dozen text messages, each one more frantic than the last. Dad was asking where I was, if I was okay, begging me to come home so they could talk. Mom was saying she was sorry, that she didn't mean what she'd said, that she was just stressed and took it out on me. My sister was claiming she'd been having a bad day and had said things she didn't mean. But here's the thing about serving overseas. It teaches you to see through bullshit pretty quickly. When someone shows you who they really are, you believe them. And last night, my family had shown me exactly how they felt about having me in their lives. The missed calls kept coming. I could see my phone lighting up every few minutes with Dad's number. Part of me wanted to answer, wanted to go back and pretend everything could be fixed with a few apologies and some awkward family dinners. But I'd learned something important in the military. You don't negotiate from a position of weakness, and you don't stay where you're not wanted. I had some money saved from my service, enough for a deposit on an apartment and a few months' rent. I had job interviews lined up. I had skills and experience that employers valued. What I didn't have was any reason to go back to a house where I was seen as a problem to be solved rather than a son and brother to be welcomed home. I started making calls. First to a real estate agent about apartments, then to confirm my job interviews, then to a furniture store about basic necessities. I was methodically building a new life, one that didn't depend on people who'd made it clear I wasn't welcome in theirs. The calls from home kept coming. By noon, I'd received 31 missed calls. I finally answered when Dad called for the 4th time in 10 minutes. His voice was shaky, panicked. He asked where I was, told me everyone was worried sick, begged me to come home. I told him I was fine, that I was safe, but that I wouldn't be coming back to the house. He started crying then, which broke something in me. He said he was sorry, that Mom and my sister were sorry, that they'd all said things they didn't mean. I told him they'd said exactly what they meant. That when people are angry, they tell the truth, and the truth was that I was unwelcome in my own family. He tried to argue, but I cut him off. I told him I loved him, but I couldn't stay somewhere I wasn't wanted, somewhere my very presence caused stress and unhappiness. He begged me not to disappear again, not to cut them out of my life entirely. I promised I wouldn't, that I'd stay in touch with him, but that I needed space from Mom and my sister. I needed time to figure out how to have a relationship with people who'd made it clear they preferred life without me. The conversation ended with both of us crying. I felt terrible for hurting him, but I also felt something I hadn't felt in months: relief. For the first time since coming home, I was making decisions based on what was best for me, not what would keep everyone else comfortable. I found an apartment that afternoon. Small, clean, affordable. The landlord was a veteran himself and was willing to waive some of the usual requirements when I explained my situation. I could move in within the week. My phone kept ringing, but I only answered Dad's calls. Mom left voicemails that swung between apologetic and frustrated. She'd say she was sorry, then ask why I was being so dramatic, then apologize again. My sister left exactly one message, asking why I was doing this to the family, why I was making everyone worry just because I couldn't handle a little criticism. That message told me everything I needed to know. She still didn't understand that what they'd done was wrong. She thought I was overreacting, being too sensitive. She genuinely believed that telling me I'd always been the problem was just a little criticism. The next few days were a blur of apartment hunting, job interviews, and fielding increasingly desperate calls from home. Dad was the only one who seemed to understand the gravity of what had happened. He'd call just to check on me, not to beg me to come home, but to make sure I was eating, sleeping, taking care of myself. During one of our calls, he told me something that changed everything. He said that after I'd left that night, he'd confronted Mom and my sister about what they'd said. The conversation had gotten heated, and some things had come out that he'd never known before. Apparently, my sister had been bitter about my military service from the beginning. She'd felt like I was abandoning the family, like I thought I was better than the life they'd built in our small town. When I'd missed major family events due to deployments, she'd taken it personally, convinced that I was choosing the military over them. Mom had been struggling with empty nest syndrome when I first left, and my sister had been her constant companion through Dad's health scare and her own injury. They'd grown closer while I was gone, and my return had disrupted that dynamic. Mom was torn between being happy to have me home and feeling guilty for the closeness she'd developed with my sister in my absence. None of this excused what they'd said, but it helped me understand where it had come from. They'd been carrying resentment for years, and my return had been the catalyst that brought it all to the surface. Dad apologized for not defending me that night, said he'd been so shocked by what they were saying that he'd frozen. He admitted he'd known there was tension, but hadn't realized how deep the problem went. He'd spent the last few days trying to mediate, but both Mom and my sister were defensive about their behavior. I told him I appreciated the explanation, but that understanding why they'd hurt me didn't automatically heal the damage. Trust, once broken, wasn't easily repaired. I'd spent months feeling like I was walking on eggshells in my own family's home, and now I knew why. They'd genuinely seen me as an intruder in the life they'd built while I was serving overseas. Update 1. A week later, I moved into my new apartment. It was strange, coming from the chaos of military barracks to the silence of my own place. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have space that was truly mine, where I didn't have to worry about disturbing anyone or being judged for existing. Dad helped me move my things from the house. It was awkward, with Mom and my sister hovering around trying to talk to me. Mom kept apologizing, saying she'd been stressed and had taken it out on me. My sister was more defensive, insisting that everyone had said things they regretted and asking why I was making such a big deal out of one argument. I kept my responses short and polite. I wasn't interested in rehashing the fight or listening to justifications. I was focused on moving forward, on building a life where I didn't have to question whether I was wanted or welcome. The apartment slowly became home. I bought furniture piece by piece, hung photos from my military service, set up a small office space for job hunting. For the first time since returning from overseas, I felt like I had control over my environment. I got a job offer from one of my interviews, a security consulting firm that valued my military experience. The work was interesting, the pay was good, and my colleagues treated me with respect. It was exactly what I needed to rebuild my confidence and sense of purpose. Dad and I maintained regular contact. We'd meet for coffee once a week, and he'd update me on how things were going at home. Mom was still struggling with guilt about what had happened, frequently asking Dad when I was coming over for dinner. My sister had apparently moved on, rarely mentioning me at all, which told me everything I needed to know about her priorities. 3 weeks after moving out, Mom showed up at my apartment unannounced. She looked tired, older somehow, and immediately started crying when I opened the door. She asked if we could talk, and despite my better judgment, I let her in. She sat on my couch and apologized again, but this time it felt different. She wasn't just sorry about the fight. She was sorry about how they'd treated me since I'd come home. She admitted that having me back had been harder than she'd expected, not because she didn't want me there, but because it had reminded her of how much she'd missed me while I was gone. She told me that watching me struggle to find my place in the family had been painful, that she'd taken her own guilt and frustration out on me instead of addressing the real issues. She said she'd been wrong to let my sister's resentment influence how she treated me, and she was ashamed of the things she'd said that night. I listened without interrupting, trying to gauge whether this was genuine remorse or just another attempt to manipulate me into coming back. When she was finished, I told her I appreciated the apology, but that words alone couldn't undo the damage that had been done. I explained that I'd spent months feeling unwelcome in my own family's home, walking on eggshells and second-guessing every interaction. I told her that learning they preferred life without me had been devastating, that it had shaken my fundamental understanding of who I was and where I belonged. She cried harder then, saying she'd never wanted me to feel that way, that she'd been wrong to make me feel unwelcome. But I reminded her that impact matters more than intent. Regardless of what she'd meant to do, the result was that her son had felt like a stranger in his own family. The conversation lasted 2 hours. By the end, we both understood that rebuilding our relationship would take time and effort from both sides. I wasn't ready to forgive and forget, but I was willing to work towards something better if she was genuinely committed to change. She asked if I'd consider coming to family dinner the following Sunday. I told her I wasn't ready for that, but that I'd think about it. She nodded, hugged me goodbye, and left looking slightly more hopeful than when she'd arrived. That night, I called Dad to tell him about Mom's visit. He sounded relieved, said he'd been hoping she'd take responsibility for her part in what had happened. He also warned me that my sister was still defensive about the whole situation, still convinced that I was overreacting to what she saw as a minor family disagreement. Update 2. A month into living on my own, I was settling into a routine that felt sustainable and healthy. Work was going well, I'd made friends with some of my colleagues, and I was rediscovering who I was outside of the complicated dynamics of my family relationships. Dad and I continued our weekly coffee meetings, and slowly, very slowly, Mom and I started talking on the phone occasionally. She seemed genuinely committed to understanding how her actions had affected me, and our conversations were more honest than they'd been in years. My sister, however, remained a problem. According to Dad, she was frustrated that I hadn't gotten over what had happened. She'd made several comments about how I was being dramatic, how families fight and then move on, how my refusal to come around was hurting Dad and making everyone else miserable. The breaking point came when she showed up at my workplace. I was in a meeting with a client when my colleague knocked on the conference room door and told me there was a family emergency. My heart dropped, thinking something had happened to Dad or that Mom had been in an accident. I excused myself from the meeting and rushed to the lobby, where I found my sister waiting with red eyes and a determined expression. She told me that Dad was in the hospital, that he'd had another heart episode, and was asking for me. My blood went cold, and I immediately grabbed my keys and headed for the door. But something about her demeanor felt off, so I stopped and asked for more details. Her story started falling apart immediately. She couldn't tell me which hospital, couldn't explain why she'd come to get me instead of just calling, couldn't provide any specifics about Dad's condition. When I pulled out my phone to call him directly, she tried to stop me, claiming the doctors had said no phone calls. That's when I knew she was lying. I called Dad right there in the lobby, and he answered on the second ring, sounding perfectly fine. He was at home, watching TV, completely unaware that his daughter had told me he was in the hospital. When I explained what was happening, there was a long silence before he told me he'd deal with my sister and hung up. I turned to her and asked what the hell she thought she was doing. She broke down then, admitting that she'd made up the story because she was desperate to get me to talk to her. She said the family was falling apart because of my stubbornness, that Mom was depressed and Dad was caught in the middle, and that I needed to stop being selfish and come home. I was furious. Using a fake medical emergency to manipulate me was beyond inappropriate. It was cruel. I told her that lying about Dad's health had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that she'd proven exactly why I couldn't trust her or feel safe around her. She started crying, claiming she was just trying to fix the family, that she didn't know what else to do. But I was done listening to her justifications. I told her that if she ever pulled a stunt like this again, I'd cut off all contact with her permanently. Then I walked back into my meeting and tried to salvage what was left of my professional reputation. My colleagues were understanding when I explained that there had been a family miscommunication, but I was embarrassed and angry. My sister's desperate attempt at reconciliation had not only failed spectacularly, but had also created problems for me at work. That evening, Dad called to apologize for my sister's behavior. He was mortified that she'd lied about his health, especially given his actual heart problems. He assured me that he'd had a serious conversation with her about boundaries and appropriate behavior. He also told me something interesting. Apparently, my absence from family gatherings had been more disruptive than I'd realized. Mom had been struggling with depression, partly due to guilt about how they'd treated me. My sister was frustrated because she'd expected me to just get over it and come back, allowing everyone to pretend nothing had happened. but I wasn't interested in pretending. What had happened that night had revealed fundamental problems in how my family communicated and resolved conflicts. My sister's willingness to lie about a medical emergency to get her way only confirmed that she still didn't understand the seriousness of what had occurred. I told Dad that while I appreciated his efforts to mediate, I needed my sister to understand that actions have consequences. I couldn't have a relationship with someone who would manipulate me with fake emergencies and then blame me for being upset about it. Update 3. 2 months after moving out, I received a letter in the mail. Not an email or a text, but an actual handwritten letter from my sister. It was 3 pages long, and for the first time since this whole mess started, it felt like she was finally taking responsibility for her actions. She apologized for lying about Dad's health, acknowledging that it was manipulative and wrong. She admitted that she'd been carrying resentment about my military service for years, feeling abandoned and forgotten when I'd chosen to enlist instead of staying close to home. She wrote about how she'd struggled after her divorce, how moving back in with our parents had been humiliating, and how my return had made her feel even more like a failure. She'd projected her own insecurities onto me, convincing herself that I thought I was better than the rest of the family because I'd seen the world and had experiences they hadn't. The letter was raw and honest in a way that our previous conversations hadn't been. She admitted that she'd been jealous of the pride our parents had felt about my service, that she'd resented the way people in town treated me like a hero when I came back. She'd wanted to tear me down because building me up had made her feel smaller. But the most important part of the letter was her acknowledgement that none of her feelings justified how she'd treated me. She wrote that she understood now why I'd left, why I'd needed space, and why her attempt to manipulate me with the fake emergency had been so damaging. She wasn't asking for forgiveness or for me to come back. She was just taking responsibility for the pain she'd caused. I read the letter 3 times before deciding how to respond. Part of me was still angry, still hurt by months of feeling unwelcome in my own family. But another part of me recognized that this was the first time my sister had shown genuine self-awareness about her behavior. I wrote back, not to forgive her entirely, but to acknowledge her apology and explain how her actions had affected me. I told her about the months of walking on eggshells, the way her words that night had shattered my sense of belonging, and how the fake emergency had made it impossible for me to trust her. But I also told her that I understood where her resentment had come from, even if I didn't excuse how she'd expressed it. Military service meant missing important family moments, and I could see how that might have felt like abandonment to someone who was struggling with their own problems. I suggested that if she was serious about repairing our relationship, we should start with supervised conversations in neutral locations. Dad could mediate, and we could work on rebuilding trust slowly, without the pressure of family dinners or pretending everything was fine. She agreed immediately, seeming relieved that I was willing to try. Our first conversation, with Dad present at a local coffee shop, was awkward but productive. We talked about our childhood, about the different paths our lives had taken, and about how we both contributed to the communication breakdown in our family. It wasn't magical, and it didn't fix everything overnight, but it was a start. Meanwhile, my relationship with Mom continued to improve gradually. She'd started therapy to deal with her guilt and learn better communication skills. Our phone calls became more regular, and occasionally she'd visit my apartment, always calling first and respecting my boundaries. The job was going incredibly well. My military experience was valuable in the security consulting world, and I'd earned the respect of my colleagues and clients. I was making good money, building professional relationships, and feeling like I had a future worth working toward. Looking back on that terrible night when my family told me I'd always been the issue, I realized that in some ways, they'd been right, just not in the way they'd meant it. I had been the issue, but not because I was a problem to be solved. I'd been the issue because my presence had forced everyone to confront problems they'd been avoiding, resentments they'd been harboring, and communication patterns that weren't working. My leaving had been the catalyst for real change in my family. Mom was in therapy, my sister was working on her jealousy and resentment, and Dad was learning to set boundaries instead of just trying to keep everyone happy. None of this growth would have happened if I'd just accepted the status quo and continued to feel unwelcome in my own family. 6 months after that devastating conversation in the kitchen, I hosted my first family dinner in my apartment. It was small, just the 4 of us, and there were still moments of tension and awkwardness. But there was also honesty, respect, and a genuine effort from everyone to do better. My sister and I weren't best friends, but we were learning to be siblings again. Mom and I were rebuilding trust slowly but surely. Dad was relieved to see his family working toward healing instead of just managing damage. I'd learned something important about family dynamics. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept unacceptable treatment. Sometimes walking away is what forces people to examine their behavior and make real changes. And sometimes the person who gets blamed for being the issue is actually the one brave enough to demand that everyone do better. I'd come home from military service expecting to slot back into the family I'd left behind. Instead, I'd had to build a new family dynamic from the ground up, one based on mutual respect instead of obligation, honesty instead of keeping the peace, and boundaries instead of just enduring bad treatment. It had been painful, devastating at times, but ultimately necessary. The family I had now was smaller, more careful with each other, and infinitely more genuine than the one I'd tried to return to. And that was worth all the missed calls, all the tears, and all the nights spent wondering if I'd ever feel like I belonged anywhere again. Sometimes you have to lose your family to find them. Sometimes you have to leave home to create one worth coming back to.